In the early hours of June 6, 1944, over 6,000 men of the 82nd Airborne Division crossed the dark skies over the English Channel, headed towards the coast of Normandy. Their mission was to seize the bridges, crossroads and towns that would determine if the seaborne infantry that were landing on Utah Beach at dawn could break inland or be driven back into the sea. They had to hold these objectives at all costs. Almost immediately, everything went wrong. Dense cloud swallowed the peninsula. German flak tore through the formations, causing the pilots to veer off course. When the paratroopers dropped into the darkness of the French countrysides, they found themselves alone, miles from where they were supposed to be, deep inside enemy territory. But for one group of men, the jump was almost too accurate. The town of Sainte-Mère-Église was lit up by a burning building, alive with activity, swarming with German soldiers, and the men of the 505th had landed straight in the middle of it. Just before midnight, a fire broke out at one of the houses near the town square, which was likely sparked by a Pathfinder flare that had drifted off course. The flames climbed into the night sky, casting an orange glow across the Norman rooftops. The German garrison, concerned the blaze might spread, had lifted the curfew and permitted Mayor Alexander Bruneau to assemble a bucket brigade. Over 100 civilians had gathered beneath the watchful eyes of the armed German garrison. The once quiet, dark town was now alive with activity, voices calling out, water splashing against timber, and the crackle of burning wood. Suddenly, the night filled with the drone of C-47s, and the sky blossomed with the white canopies of descending paratroopers. Catastrophe struck as F Company of the 505th had dropped directly over the illuminated square. The fire had turned them into targets silhouetted against the night. The Germans opened fire immediately. Paratroopers, still tangled in their harnesses, were killed before their boots touched French soil. One paratrooper got stuck in a nearby tree. German soldiers emptied the magazines of their submachine guns into him. He hung there with his eyes open, as though staring down at his own wounds. Private John Steele of F Company drifted toward the church. A burst of flak tore into his foot during the descent. As he was about to land, his canopy snagged on a stone gargoyle on the bell tower. He hung there, helpless and wounded, and suspended in full view of the carnage below. He could do nothing but watch his fellow paratroopers die, so he played dead. Below him in the square, Sergeant John Ray, a 21-year-old newlywed from Louisiana, had landed hard and struggled with his harness. A German soldier spotted Ray and shot him in the stomach. Ray collapsed. The German soldier then turned his weapon upward, towards the helpless Americans hanging from the church. In a final burst of life, the fatally wounded sergeant drew his Colt 45 pistol, knelt in the square and shot the German soldier. Sergeant Ray then died, having saved the lives of Private Steele and Private Kenneth Russell, who hung nearby. German Corporal Rudolf May and his observation team watched as the chaos unfolded. One of May's men raised his rifle towards Steele, still dangling motionless against the stone church. May stopped him, reasoning that shooting a helpless prisoner would invite retaliation. Instead, May cut Steele down and took him prisoner. In the chaos, Kenneth Russell and a handful of F Company survivors slipped away into the darkness of the French countryside. The misdrop, while catastrophic for F Company, played an unexpected role in the broader confusion that paralysed the German response. The garrison initially believed the low-flying C-47 were damaged Allied bombers, hit by flak and heading northwest. Precious minutes were wasted as patrols searched empty fields for downed flight crews. Scattered American paratroopers had severed communication lines across the countryside, which further added to the chaos. Unable to determine the invasion's true scope and fearing friendly fire in the darkness, the Sainte-Mère-Église garrison made a fateful decision: withdraw 2 kilometers south to their command post at Fauville to regroup, leaving just a handful of men in Sainte-Mère-Église. As the majority of the German garrison retreated south to Fauville, Lieutenant Colonel Edward C. Krauss was already assembling his forces. He was a 27-year-old veteran of Sicily and Naples who had never relinquished an objective once taken. Krauss landed in Drop Zone O, just west of Sainte-Mère-Église. He began moving towards the assembly point, using his cricket clicker to signal scattered paratroopers in the darkness. Men emerged from hedgerows and apple orchards. Flash was the challenge, and thunder was the response. Krauss had gathered approximately 50 men. More arrived steadily, small groups of 2 or 3, and sometimes individual stragglers who had landed miles from their intended zone. By 0230 hours, he had assembled around 80 men at the edge of Sainte-Mère-Église. But Krauss made a critical decision. Instead of attacking immediately with inadequate numbers, he waited, assembling approximately 150 men over the next 45 minutes. This patience under pressure demonstrated his combat experience. As his force grew, Krauss formed 2 provisional companies from whoever had arrived, regardless of their original unit assignments. Around 0315 hours, they encountered a French civilian who volunteered to guide them to the town. Krauss faced a dilemma. Was this man leading them into an ambush? He sent the guide ahead with a small recon element while the main force waited at a distance. The guide proved reliable. The German garrison was scattered and disorganized. Krauss had his opening. He now had a force capable of taking and holding the town, and as if almost by luck, the majority of the Germans had pulled out after the earlier fighting. He then issued one of the most audacious tactical orders of D-Day. His men would assault the town with their rifles completely unloaded. They would use only knives, bayonets, and grenades. The logic was brilliant, but also dangerous. In complete darkness, with friend and foe impossible to distinguish, any muzzle flash would instantly reveal a firing position. If American rifles were empty, then every flash of gunfire had to be German. The paratroopers moved silently, through hedgerows, behind buildings, along shadowed alleys, communicating only with hand signals. They found the town eerily quiet. The house fire had died down to embers, and the French civilians had returned home. The church square lay silent except for the soft creak of parachutes still hanging from trees, and the bodies of F Company still tangled in their harnesses. Krauss's force located the German barracks building. The Americans tossed grenades through windows and rushed inside with knives and bayonets in hand. 30 German soldiers surrendered immediately. Approximately 10 who resisted were killed. Not a single American was lost during the assault on the town. Within 30 minutes, Krauss's men had established blocking positions on the 5 main roads entering the town and severed the German communication cable to Cherbourg. At 0430 hours, Krauss walked to the Hotel de Ville and raised the same American flag his regiment had flown over Naples 8 months earlier. He radioed division headquarters with a single sentence, "I am in Sainte-Mère-Église." It was the first French town liberated on D-Day. As Krauss secured Sainte-Mère-Église, 2 kilometers to the west, another battle was already unfolding at the Murderay crossings. First Lieutenant John Dolan, called Red Dog for his red hair and hard-nosed fighting style, led A Company of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment towards the west from their drop zone. This was his 3rd combat jump. He had already fought in Sicily and at Salerno. His company had made the most accurate American drop of D-Day. As Dolan moved towards La Fière, he assembled 90% of his men, an extraordinary achievement when other regiments were scattered across 30 miles of enemy territory. By the time they reached the manor, he had 100 paratroopers by his side. Dolan signalled his men forward. The manor was silent until the MG-42s opened up from the 2nd floor. Lieutenant Donald Coxon and his scout were cut down in the first burst. During the flanking manoeuvre that followed, the casualties mounted with terrible speed. Major James McGinnity, the battalion executive officer, was shot through the head while leading his men through the hedgerows. Lieutenant Robert McLaughlin went down moments later, hit in the leg and the stomach. Dolan found himself pinned in a captured German foxhole, returning fire with his Thompson submachine gun as bullets snapped through the air above him. What should have been a quick assault was turning into a morning-long siege. On the far side of the river, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Timms had 30 men gathered around him. Timms moved towards Amphreville, where he could hear the crackle of gunfire echoing through the pre-dawn darkness. Thinking his battalion was already attacking their objective, he advanced to join the fight. But the Germans in Amphreville were not under attack, They were waiting. Realising he was badly outnumbered and outgunned, Timms made the only decision that would keep his men alive: withdraw northeast away from the killing ground. His men pulled back under sporadic fire until they reached an orchard near the river, where Timms established a defensive perimeter. Cut off from headquarters with no working radio, they had no idea if Fière had been taken or if anyone else had even survived the jump. Timms needed eyes on the bridges. He sent Lieutenant Louis Levy to the south with a small patrol to scout Cockney. Levy's group picked their way through flooded fields. Along the way they encountered 20 scattered men from D Company who joined them on their mission. When they reached Cockney, the tiny village was silent. There were no Germans and no Americans, just the ancient stone church standing alone in the grey morning light. Lieutenant Levy posted his men around the churchyard and settled into wait, watching the road for whatever would come first, American reinforcements or the enemy. Back at Fière, the Americans were still pinned down by heavy fire from the manor, but the situation was about to change dramatically. Between 7:30 and 9 in the morning, scattered groups of paratroopers converged on the manor from multiple directions, drawn by the sound of gunfire and the landmarks they had memorised in England. Brigadier General James Gavin arrived with men from the 507th. They had crossed the flooded area by following the embankment beside the train tracks. Captain Ben Schwarzwalder brought 75 men from G Company, having climbed up from the train tracks onto the Sainte-Mère-Église road. Colonel Roy Linguist arrived with men from the 508th, also having moved down the embankment. By noon, approximately 550 American paratroopers surrounded the manor. Major General Ridgway had arrived shortly after 11 o'clock and placed Colonel Linguist in command of the convergent forces. Captain Schwarzwalder's men attacked from the left, as Dolan's A Company advanced on the right. Lieutenant William Oakley's patrol, which had been working around from the south along the riverbank for hours, charged in from the rear. For the first time that morning, the Germans inside the manor were taking fire from 3 directions at once. The MG-42s that had pinned down every American approach since dawn could no longer cover all sides. As the gunners swung to meet Schwarzwalder's assault from the left flank, Dolan and his men pushed towards the manor on the right flank. Paratroopers sprinted through a hail of machine gun fire, vaulting over stone walls and crashing through the hedgerow gaps as rifle fire cracked off the manor's facade. An American bazooka round through the first floor window had broke the German resistance. 28 defenders had held off the Americans for nearly 7 hours, buying precious time for German forces to prepare their counterattack. When the Americans finally cleared the buildings, the LaRue family emerged from their wine cellar. They were shaken but alive. The manor was taken, but the causeway beyond was still firmly in enemy hands. With the manor secured, Gavin left Linguist in charge at Fière and moved south to Chef-du-Pont. Colonel Linguist ordered Schwarzwalder to cross the causeway and secure the western end of Cockney. Lieutenant Marr took point. As his scouts advanced along the elevated road, Private James Mattingly came under fire from a German machine gun position dug into the shoulder of the causeway. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds. James Mattingly fired all 8 rounds of his M1 rifle, grabbed a grenade from his belt, and hurled it into the enemy position. 4 Germans stood up with their hands raised. As Mattingly covered these prisoners, 5 more Germans rose from the concealed position behind him. In 15 seconds, without reinforcement or support, he had captured 9 Germans and 2 machine guns. As Schwarzwalder's force reached Cockney Church at the western end of the causeway, a yellow smoke grenade popped in the churchyard, the pre-arranged signal for friendly forces. Lieutenant Louis Levy was already there with his small unit, having been sent earlier by Colonel Timms. Schwarzwalder was delighted to find his objective already secured, but when he learned that Lieutenant Colonel Timms was only a mile north with a small group of men, isolated and cut off, he ordered his men to move north and link up with them. He left Levy with just 8 men at Cockney Church and took the remaining unit towards Timms' position. 2 kilometres south, a second causeway spanned the flooded murderay at the village of Chef-du-Pont. Whoever controlled it controlled another route to Utah Beach, making it a vital objective for both the American and German forces. Earlier in the day, General Gavin sent Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Osberg and Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Maloney with around 100 men to seize the bridge. The town itself was lightly held. The Germans had withdrawn to defensive positions along the causeway just west of the bridge, where the terrain gave them every advantage. Osberg's men charged through Chef-du-Pont towards the crossing, knowing that speed was their only hope. They knew the bridge must be taken before the Germans could organise their defence, so they made a semi-organised dash for it. They were too late. 2 officers reached the bridge and both were shot, one toppling off the structure and into the water below, the other falling dead on the eastern approach. The officer who fell into the river was Osberg himself. He was hit multiple times by machine gun fire. Sergeant Robert Vaneter and another soldier pulled him from the flooded marsh. He would survive with a collapsed lung and wounds to his arm, but the attack had stalled completely. While the Americans held the eastern bank, the Germans would maintain control of the causeway. Just like La Fière, the bridge at Chef-du-Pont had become a deadlock. On the German-controlled side of the Murderay, another group of paratroopers was fighting for survival within the chaos. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Shanley, who was commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 508, had dropped east of Pickaville, scattered far from his intended drop zone, just like most of his regiment. Throughout the morning, he had moved from hedgerow to hedgerow, gathering lost paratroopers from half a dozen different units. By mid-afternoon, he had assembled a makeshift unit from strangers who had never trained together. His objective was the bridges over the River Douth to the southwest, and he led his men toward it with determination. But within a mile of the crossing, German 88mm guns opened fire at point-blank range, their flat trajectories turning the Norman lanes into kill zones. There was no way through. With his attack stopped cold, Shanley made the decision to fall back and consolidate. He withdrew his forces to a piece of high ground, a modest rise on the maps labelled simply as Hill 30. By evening, his men had dug in, overlooking the flooded Murderay Valley, establishing a defensive perimeter in the hedgerows and orchards. They had no way of knowing they would be surrounded and under siege for the next 4 days. Another battle was unfolding 3 kilometres to the north, a battle that would determine if German reinforcements could reach Sainte-Mère-Église and crush the invasion before it could take root. The northern flank of Sainte-Mère-Église was exposed. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort, commanding the 2nd Battalion despite having broken his ankle on the parachute drop, could spare only a single platoon from his already thinly stretched line. 42 men, tasked with blocking the main highway from Cherbourg and preventing German counterattacks on the entire north approach. Lieutenant Turner Turnbull led them to a low rise 40 yards north of the hamlet of Neuville. The position gave them perfect observation of the road ahead, 500 yards of open fields before the terrain offered any cover to an approaching enemy. If the Germans wanted to use this highway, they would have to come through his platoon. The men who followed Turnbull called him the Chief, a nod to his Choctaw heritage. He had already proven what he was made of during the Sicily invasion the previous summer. His C-47 had been shot down. His wound qualified him to go home. But Turnbull refused. He rejoined his men just in time to make the jump into Normandy on D-Day. Now, he crouched in a Norman hedgerow, watching the road from Cherbourg, waiting for the enemy he knew would come. Around 10:30 in the morning, the first German column appeared on the horizon. Approximately 200 soldiers of the Grenadier Regiment 1058th marched down the road in a formation that suggested they had no idea what was waiting for them. Turnbull let them come, watching through the hedgerow as the distance closed. When his platoon opened fire, the effect was devastating, unleashing a torrent of precisely aimed fire into the packed German column. German soldiers fell in the road, in the ditches, and in the fields on either side. The attack stopped cold, the survivors scrambling for cover as bullets snapped through the morning air. The Germans pulled back to regroup, but they did not retreat. They were too many and the Americans too few. They knew they had the advantage. Instead, they deployed their mortars to fix the American soldiers in place while infantry began to attack around both flanks. The Germans probed and pushed, testing Turnbull's perimeter from every angle. Mortar rounds crashed into the hedgerows, showering the paratroopers with dirt and debris. Machine gun fire swept the American positions whenever a man showed himself, and all the while, German infantry crept closer on both flanks, gradually encircling the small American force. Turnbull's men held their ground. Each attack that came was met with the same disciplined fire that had shattered the first column. But the ammunition was running low and the casualty count was climbing. By late afternoon, Turnbull's 42 men had been reduced to just 23. The Germans had closed around both flanks and were preparing to cut the only escape route back to American lines. Turnbull gathered his surviving men and asked for their judgment. Private First Class Joseph Sebastian had just returned from a reconnaissance of the rear. The Germans hadn't completely closed the trap. There was still a gap, still a chance to withdraw through the hedgerows to friendly lines. Turnbull considered the alternative: 23 men against 200, with no ammunition to spare and enemies on three sides. Turnbull made his final decision as their commander. They would conduct a fighting withdrawal, get the survivors out and live to fight another day. There was just one problem: someone had to stay behind to cover the retreat. Technical Sergeant Robert Nyland volunteered. The 25-year-old from Tonawanda, New York, took up a position with a machine gun alongside Corporal James Kelly. As the rest of the platoon began their withdrawal through the hedgerows, Nyland opened fire on the advancing Germans, the gun kicking in his hands as he burned through box after box of ammunition. The Germans turned their attention to the machine gun that was tearing into their ranks. Nyland kept his finger on the trigger, giving his unit time to escape, buying their lives of his own. Eventually, the German bullets found their mark. Both Nyland and Kelly were killed as the machine gun they manned fell silent. The Germans had captured Neuville. But crucially, they had been stopped for 8 hours. During those 8 hours, German forces had mounted an attack to the south of Sainte-Mère-Église, pushing up from the direction of Carentan. Turnbull's stand kept the paratroopers at Sainte-Mère-Église from being hit simultaneously from north and south during the most critical hours of D-Day. At Coquigny, Lieutenant Levy waited with his small band of soldiers for reinforcements to come. When the rumble of tank engines echoed from the direction of Amfreville, he knew his position was hopeless. 3 German tanks and a company of infantry from Grenadier Regiment 1057 rolled towards the church, a force his handful of men couldn't hope to stop. Levy's paratroopers returned fire, but the sheer size of the German force overwhelmed them. With 2 men dead and the enemy closing from 3 sides, Levy gathered his survivors and withdrew north towards Tim's Orchard. Coquigny fell into German hands. As if by sheer bad luck, B Company of the 508th was already on the Causeway when Coquigny collapsed, a small unit under Lieutenant Homer Jones, heading to reinforce a position that no longer existed. Caught in the open, Jones's company walked straight into the German counterattack on the Causeway. Machine guns and tank fire shook the Causeway from multiple angles, cutting the Americans down with nowhere to hide. Within minutes, most of the company was dead or wounded. Jones and a handful of survivors fought their way back to Fière, their units shattered. The Germans had swept through Coquigny and beaten back the American reinforcements, and now they had their sights fixed on Fière Bridge. The survivors of B Company had barely reached the eastern bank when the rumble of tank engines echoed across the marsh once more. At Fière Bridge, Lieutenant Dolan's A Company had been dug in since morning. Engineers had laid anti-tank mines on the Causeway and positioned a 57mm anti-tank gun 150 yards back. Their last line of defence waited on the bridge itself, 2 bazooka teams crouched in foxholes below road level. On the north side, Private First Class John Boulderson and Private Gordon Prime. On the south, Private First Class Leonard Peterson and Private Marcus Heim. They could hear what was coming, but they could do nothing but wait. The German column appeared at the western end of the Causeway. The same tanks and infantry that had overwhelmed Coquigny were now advancing towards the bridge itself. The lead tank reached a curve near the bridge. Its commander stood up in the turret to observe the American positions, and a machine gun burst from the manor cut him down instantly. A hail of fire erupted from the eastern side of the bridge as the American guns opened fire. A well-placed shot from the anti-tank gun tore through the lead tank's track, and the crippled machine slewed sideways across the narrow road. The second tank was following too close. Using the leader as a shield, it had no room to stop, and rode up onto the back of the disabled vehicle, its belly suddenly exposed. The bazooka teams didn't hesitate. Peterson and Heim climbed from their foxholes and moved behind a concrete telephone pole, aiming for a clear shot through the branches. They fired into the angled underside of the second tank. They fell back as the second tank erupted in flames, but the fight had cost them most of their ammunition. Peterson asked Heim to cross the road and check if Boulderson had any rockets left. Heim ran across the road, through a maelstrom of crossfire from tanks, machine guns, mortars and rifles, reached the other position, and found a damaged bazooka lying abandoned. Boulderson and Prime were gone, either wounded or killed. He grabbed their rockets and ran back, again untouched through the same storm of fire. Major Kellum and Captain Royston, seeing the situation unfold, ran forward with more ammunition to resupply the sole remaining bazooka team. As the pair dashed towards the front, a German mortar round landed between them. Kellum was killed instantly. Royston was mortally wounded, dying hours later. The third tank kept coming, grinding over the debris on the causeway. Peterson and Heim, who were now resupplied with the rockets Heim had retrieved, took aim and fired their last rounds. The third tank went up in flames. The German infantry, their armour destroyed and their assault broken, withdrew towards Cockney. The bridge, for now, remained in American hands. As the smoke cleared over the causeway, the cost of holding La Fière bridge became evident. All 7 men who manned the 57mm anti-tank gun had been killed keeping their weapon in operation. The battle cost the 1st Battalion of the 505th dearly. With 3 senior officers dead in a single day, the command of the shattered 1st Battalion fell to 1st Lieutenant Dolan, the highest ranking man still standing. Word of the carnage reached Brigadier General Gavin at Chef-du-Pont, along with news that somehow, against all odds, the bridge at La Fière still held. He returned immediately, and shortly after his arrival, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Alexander appeared from Sainte-Mère-Église. He was the natural choice to take over the decimated battalion. When Alexander asked where he should place his men, Gavin said, "You better stay on this side as it looks like the Germans are getting pretty strong over there." By nightfall on June 6th, the situation along the Meurthe was precarious at best. The Americans had repelled constant attacks on Sainte-Mère-Église throughout the day, and despite the loss of Neuville, the town remained secure. They held the bridges and eastern banks at both La Fière and Chef-du-Pont, but the Germans controlled both causeways and the entire western shore. Hundreds of men of the 82nd Airborne remained isolated on the wrong side of the river, cut off, running low on ammunition, and facing an enemy that now knew exactly where they were. The 3-day battle for the Meurthe crossings had only just begun. Lieutenant John Marr had been trapped in Tim's orchard for more than 30 hours when Colonel Timms ordered him to find a way out. Without radio contact, they had no way to coordinate with forces on the eastern bank, no way to call for resupply, no way to know if anyone even knew they were alive. Timms needed a route across the flooded marsh, some path that might link them with the American forces he hoped were still holding at La Fière Bridge. Marr took his runner, a soldier named Carter, and headed north along a dirt road that led to the water's edge. What he found there would prove decisive. A submerged cobblestone road stretched out across the flooded marsh, invisible from the air, hidden beneath the murky water, but solid underfoot. By evening, Marr had delivered his report to the American forces on the eastern side of the river. Finally, there was a way across the marsh, a way to flank the Germans and the kill zone on the causeway. General Gavin decided to act on it. He selected the 1st Battalion of the 325th under Major Teddy Sanford for a flanking attack. They would cross the marsh via Marr's Submerged Road, link up with Timms in his orchard, and attack the Germans at Cockney from the north. As daylight started to fade, the 325th gathered by the water's edge. They went into the water single file, weapons held above their heads, feeling for the cobblestones with their boots as the cold marsh swallowed them to the chest. No one spoke or made a sound. The only noises were the soft splash of footsteps and the distant rumble of artillery firing somewhere to the south. The elite elements emerged from the water and entered Tim's orchard. Timms and his paratroopers had held the perimeter without reinforcement, without communication, without knowing if anyone was coming. Major Sanford and Colonel Timms huddled in the darkness, studying maps by flashlight under the cover of raincoats, working out the morning's attack. The joint force of Colonel Timms' paratroopers and Major Sanford's glider men would strike the Germans at Cockney from the north. But first, C Company had one more mission before dawn: push forward through the hedgerows and probe the German positions north of Cockney. Lieutenant Brewster Johnston took point with his platoon. They penetrated the German lines without incident, slipping between enemy positions in the darkness, moving deeper into hostile territory than anyone had expected. They were nearly at Cockney when the trap closed around them. Machine gun fire erupted from 3 directions simultaneously. Johnston went down in the first burst. His men dove for cover, scrambling into ditches on either side of the narrow lane, but there was no good cover to be found. The Germans had them pinned down from the front and both flanks, and more enemy soldiers were moving to close the rear. 40 yards back, a gap in the hedgerows offered an escape route. If the men could reach it, they might withdraw and link up with the rest of the company. But crossing that open ground meant running through German machine gun fire. Private First Class Charles DeGlopper stood up without a word, climbed out of the ditch and walked into the road. He held his Browning automatic rifle at his hip and opened fire on full automatic, pouring rounds into the German positions on either side of the lane. Enemy fire immediately shifted towards him. Behind him, his platoon began to move. A round struck DeGlopper in the side. He staggered but kept firing. Another round hit him, then another. He sank to his knees in the middle of the road, still firing, burst after burst, tearing from his BAR until the Germans finally killed him. His platoon had made it through the gap. DeGlopper's sacrifice saved the lives of his comrades and earned him the Medal of Honor. On the morning of June 9th, Major General Lawton Collins, commanding 7th Corps, arrived at Ridgway's command post shortly after dawn with a practical suggestion. The 90th Infantry Division had landed at Utah Beach and was available. The paratroopers and glider men of the 82nd had been fighting without pause since D-Day, exhausted, depleted, and their ranks thinned by 3 days of continuous combat. Collins suggested that the 90th Infantry take over and handle the capture of the crossing. But Ridgway saw it differently. This was the only mission his division had not accomplished, and they would be the ones to complete it. Collins didn't argue. However, their options to capture the Causeway were running out. The 325th flanking assault the previous night had failed, and with the bridge at Chef-du-Pont still contested, the Causeway at La Fière remained the only route west. The only way to take it was a frontal assault, 500 yards of open road straight into the guns. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Carroll, commanding the 3rd Battalion, had claimed illness and expressed doubts about whether his men could take the Causeway, comments Gavin interpreted as a lack of confidence in the mission. He relieved Carroll on the spot. General Gavin passed command to Captain John Sauls of the 325th, who would lead the first wave. Sauls was a fighter, the kind of officer who led from the front. But even Gavin harboured doubts he shared with Captain Robert Ray of the 507th in a quiet moment before the assault. When Gavin gave the sign, Ray was to push onto the Causeway and join the attack. Hitch hour was set for 10:30. At 10:30, the artillery opened up. 155mm howitzers from the 90th Division Artillery sent their shells screaming into the German defences at Cockney. Smoke rounds mixed with high explosive, covering the far end of the Causeway in a grey-white haze. For 15 minutes, the Norman countryside shook. Then the barrage lifted and a brief silence fell over the murder. Captain Sauls looked at the Causeway, looked at his men and gave the order. G Company stepped onto the road. They had covered perhaps 50 yards when the first machine gun opened fire. 1,200 rounds per minute cycling through the air. Men fell, others dove for whatever cover they could find, behind wrecked tanks and into shallow ditches. The column bunched up, momentum bleeding away as more German guns joined the first. Captain Sauls was everywhere, physically dragging men to their feet and pushing them forward. Behind them, the assault drew to a crawl. Amongst the chaos was Major General Ridgway, standing in the middle of the causeway and working to remove a tow cable from a knocked out tank which was blocking the road. General Gavin was there too, grabbing men by their harnesses, hauling them to their feet and pointing towards Cockney. Seeing their commanders facing the same dangers gave the men motivation to push forward. Captain Sauls reached the western end with 25 men. The rest of his company were scattered along the causeway. From where Gavin stood, smoke obscured the causeway's far end. He couldn't see Sauls reach Cockney. All he could see were men huddled behind wrecked tanks, dozens of bodies sprawled across the road, and soldiers crouching along the embankment in seek of any scrap of cover. The assault appeared to be stalling, the entire battalion threatening to collapse backwards. He caught Captain's Ray eye and signalled for him to move out. Ray then led his 507th paratroopers onto the causeway. They streamed across the bridge in 2 columns, with Ray at the head. As they passed glider men still pinned down along the road, they shouted for them to follow, and many did. The fresh momentum carried men forward who moments before had been paralysed by fire. Ray's company reached Cockney and joined Captain Saul's survivors, who were fighting in the hedgerows at the edge of the village. Only then did Gavin realise that Saul's had already carved out a toehold, that the assault hadn't failed after all. While the 3rd Battalion assaulted the causeway, the 1st Battalion struck from the north. Major Sanford's glider men had failed to take Cockney from behind the night before. German counterattacks have driven them back to Tim's Orchard. But now, with the frontal assault drawing every German gun eastward, he gave the order to advance. C Company led the assault, the same company that had watched DeGlopper sacrifice himself the night before. Major Sanford drove his men forward through the hedgerows with the cold fury of soldiers who had scores to settle. The Germans defending Cockney had their attention fixed on the causeway, every machine gun, every rifle pointed east towards the frontal assault. They never expected an attack from the north. The effect was devastating. Suddenly, the Germans were fighting in 2 directions. Their carefully prepared defences became death traps as fire poured in from unexpected angles. By early afternoon, the guns fell silent and the link-up was complete. Sanford's battalion joined hands with the survivors of the Causeway assault, and Tim's men finally relieved after 72 hours of isolation. Cockney was in American hands. By nightfall on June 9th, the causeway at La Fière was secure. With Cockney back in American hands, the German garrison at Amfreville abandoned the village and withdrew towards the west. Further south, the stalemate at Chef-du-Pont broke the following morning when the 90th Infantry Division arrived with armour and pushed across the causeway. On Hill 30, Lieutenant Colonel Shanley's men, who had spent days isolated and cut off from the rest of the battle, emerged from the hedgerows to finally link up with the rest of the 82nd Airborne. To the north, Colonel Van Fleet's 8th Infantry Regiment had arrived from Utah Beach and had retaken Neuville, reopening the road to Cherbourg and relieving the pressure on Sainte-Mère-Église from the north. By June 10th, the 82nd Airborne had accomplished the mission it set out to complete on D-Day, which was to secure the western flank of Utah Beach and open the route across the Continental Peninsula. The cost was devastating, over 750 casualties at La Fière alone. But the causeways were open, the bridgehead was secure, and the drive to push into the heart of Europe could begin.